I was on my own. But thinking of you, when I went to spend the night with British crime writer Harry Keating, who is now the president of the Detection Club, of which Dorothy Sayers and then Agatha Christie were also presidents in their time, and was up in his third-floor bedroom looking around for something to read to go to bed, and picked up a copy of Gaudy Night, and then realized it was Dorothy Sayers' own copy.
Oh, I think I would have died.
Her name on the flyleaf that she had donated to the Detection Club. And then, in fact, I was surrounded by all manner of books from members of the Detection Club, people like E.C. Bentley and George Chesterton and Sayers and Christie and whatever, and I couldn't sleep. I mean, I was up all night, you know, fingering these books and reading them. I talked to Harry the other night, and I said, I found it a truly incredible comment on what a sweet man he is and how trusting that he didn't frisk me.
I'm not sure. I have to hand it to you. I'm not sure I could have controlled myself. I'm afraid that copy of Gaudy Night might have, you know, slipped under my jacket.
Absolutely, and I really did think of you when I was curled up in bed up there, and I thought, if only Deborah were here.
Now Harry Keating will never have me to stay.
Well, I don't know. I didn't steal the book, so maybe you have a chance. Anyway, Dreaming of the Bones was that, it certainly was the biggest challenge, according to what you've said, but have you, and I assume that in many ways brought you, because of that, an enormous amount of pleasure. Your new book, Kissed a Sad Goodbye, do you feel has been the same experience?
I think that maybe Kissed a Sad Goodbye was harder.
Why so?
Well, in the first place, I had tremendous performance anxiety because Dreaming of the Bones did get such, you know, wonderful critical notice. I even had one critic who said, after this wonderful review of Dreaming of the Bones, this author can't possibly top this book. And I just thought, oh no, that's not what I need to hear at this point, as nice as it was. But, you know, you're very much afraid that you're going to disappoint readers who in some sense want the same book, but of course would be disappointed if they got the same book. And I finally came to the realization that all you can do is just go write your story and not worry about it. But Kissed a Sad Goodbye turned out to be a very complicated book. It has, as we said about Dreaming of the Bones, multiple storylines, multiple timelines, and the bringing together of all these elements into a cohesive whole was just, I think it was the toughest job I've ever done. I laugh. I thought I almost succumbed to multicolored index cards. I would have been better off if I had succumbed to multicolored index cards. What I ended up with before this book was finished was this huge piece of paper with each storyline, which might have been, for instance, Kincaid and Kit, or Annabelle and Reg, or Lewis and William. You know, so it wasn't for each character, but there were multiple storylines and different timelines. And so I would have in one color ink this storyline, and then a different colored ink for the next one, and so on and so forth. And there were 10 or 12 different elements. And then what needed to happen in each of these storylines to bring the book to a conclusion, and then how these different events in the storylines needed to be placed in relation to one another. So there were lines going like this in different colored ink all the way across the page and up and around and back and forth, and somehow or other it eventually all came together. But
well, it does come together. And what you've got, you're in the East End of London, which was, of course, the area that for centuries was the docks area, and then was largely obliterated by the Luftwaffe during World War II.
It's fascinating. It's a fascinating area, and one of the things that I very strongly wanted to do was to give a sense of the history and the atmosphere of Docklands, of the East End of London. And we have a mutual friend who lives on the Isle of Dogs that we've both been fortunate enough to stay with, and this was my introduction to the East End. And I am still horrified to find how many Londoners have never been east of Tower Bridge.
Well, you know, it was a blue-collar area. I mean, for a long time it was the docks, and when that, it was very much, I mean, this is, you know, wasn't Whitechapel, Jack the Ripper area.
The Ripper territory.
This was very much a very poor working class blue-collar kind of area. And then what I think is so interesting is that because it was largely blown to bits during the war, today it's become totally different. I mean, it's a very trendy, very, you know, sort of yuppie, upmarket kind of London, where even though it's so old historically, most of the buildings are new. The British press has moved from Fleet Street to Docklands, the Times and so forth. Catherine lives in an apartment that is, you know, a very modern block, and it's right across the river from Inigo Jones's magnificent building there at Greenwich, and there's the tunnel. In fact, that was wonderful in the book, where you can walk back and forth under the Thames, so I can trip over.
Very claustrophobic thing, the Greenwich Foot Tunnel.
You know, you said that, and it comes across in the book. I run back and forth under that all the time because my friend Lindsay Davis, the historic crime writer, lives right at the other end, and so I spend a lot of time when I'm visiting Catherine, you know, running back and forth to see Lindsay, and I don't think a lot about the tunnel. I do like the light railway, instead of the tube.
The DLR.
Even though it was blown, parts of it were blown up by the
bombing at South Key.
So you've got these interesting things going on historically and contemporary, how much the area has changed, and your book does tell that very tragic story of all the children who lived in the East End, who were sent out of the city without their families to board in the country and escape from World War II. Robert Barnard wrote a great book called
Out of the Blackout.
Right, with a somewhat similar, well, at least with a similar beginning. And I think the fact that you are able to do that and then braid that whole story and that child and the consequences of that uprooting and destruction of his family in the war and all into, you know, the whole tale, and also the evolution of these tea merchants, you know, the family firm over such a long time. You must have had a great time doing all the tea lore.
Oh, I did, and just an absolutely fascinating time with the World War II stuff. And I'm sure there are disadvantages to writing books set in Britain and not being British, but I think in some ways there are advantages because I come to things with a fresh eye or a fresh perspective, and one of these particular things, of course, Docklands and the destruction and the regeneration of Docklands, but the evacuation of the children, which was something that I really didn't know very much about. And there's a B&B in Surrey, in that particular part of Surrey where More Not Your Dead is set, that I like to go and stay, and I was listening to the woman who owns the farm talking one day about being evacuated from London as a child, and her family had lived in the big house up the hill, and she comes from a very famous British financial family, and about her experiences as a London child being evacuated to the country. And you know, this was my sort of first-hand introduction to this. And I was just absolutely fascinated, and I sort of picked it up and went from there, and the more I learned, the more interesting it became. The mechanics of the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of children from London were like nothing that I think has ever been seen before or since, and the sociological implications of evacuating all these working class children from London had repercussions that I don't think anybody imagined. These children that were taken out of the East End went back after the war, and nothing was ever the same because they had seen a different world.
Well, and not only that, but the world that they had left had been destroyed.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a twofold thing. Oh, I'm sure you're absolutely right, and I think you're also, I would agree with you that the perspective that you can get from a little bit of a distance for the historical stuff, I think where it's probably easier to go wrong when you're writing about another culture is in the contemporary stuff, you know, where there may be nuances that you won't pick up, but when you're doing, when you've got that, you know, that remove of time anyway, so that anybody writing about that period, whether British or not, isn't right in it.
Well, what I started to say about that, and I sort of got sidetracked, was that going back to the iceberg and the tip of the iceberg analogy, that I discovered I had to know all these things about World War II that I didn't realize at first that I would have to know. I started out thinking, well, I have to know what life was like during the Blitz. And then I discovered that I had to know what was going on the European front, I had to know what was going on the North African front, and, you know, all the politics involved, and, you know, how the campaigns were organized, because it was such a part of life for the people who were living in England and who had friends and loved ones who were on the different fronts.